Hello everybody, I'm Eric Hoffner, or Franzi Boy as most people know me online, and welcome to my first tutorial ever. And it may be my last because I cannot even get through the intro without hating my voice. But in this video I will primarily be covering tips and my thoughts over my process, and hopefully you'll take something away from it. So to start off, you'll see me throw down an image which I took myself. It's on my living room floor, and I just started to use the smudge tool to grab some of those colors and lay them out. You know, I kind of start off with a muted color palette because I'll often add too much color later on and oversaturate everything. So at the beginning here, you'll see me kind of using a discovery method or an ink blot method because I really don't know what I want to draw yet. I just kind of want to get rid of that white canvas. Otherwise, if I do know what I want to draw, I will start out with a sketch and work my way from there. But right now, what's important is to kind of work loose, big, and carefree. Once I start to see something kind of taking shape in the ink blot, I will try to define it a little more. I want to define a foreground, a midground, and a background. Because layers. People love depth, and people want to feel as if they can almost step into your painting. So I have obviously started with lighter values in the background, so that's going to be where the primary light source is coming from, and so I need to keep that foreground a little bit darker. But again, at this stage, everything loose, nothing is sacred. If I didn't like that pyramid in the background, I wouldn't be afraid to just swipe it out. I think sometimes people can lay something down and think it has to stay that way. You know, they take care of it as if it was their baby. But at the beginning stages, I feel as if nothing should be sacred. Everything can be changed if it doesn't feel like it's working in these early stages. But again, in the beginning, primarily trying to define foreground, midground, and background. Next, I will start to define the light source by creating a new layer and setting it into an overlay blending mode. This way I can add those yellows and oranges without changing anything I've already laid down. You know, I can feel free to experiment with color on this new layer. And although layers are nice, sometimes I think too many layers can make things feel detached, and so often I will merge that new layer with my previous layer and again start to color pick and paint with those newly found colors. And I would say oftentimes I am using the brush tool, but you will see me switch back and forth pretty rapidly between the brush tool and the smudge tool because I tend to use the smudge tool to get those nice blends, but I use it very lightly because too much smudging will make all your colors muddy and you'll lose a lot of that texture you get from the brush strokes that you made. And there is a way to create some texture with the smudge tool, but the power has to be up to almost 100% and your strokes have to be very definite. Any back and forth, again, with the smudge tool will create a very muddy look and you'll blend all the colors together. So just for a little bit, I'm going to speed the video up so you can kind of just watch me lay those colors down and smudge them. And on these slopes, I would say as a tip, make sure your brush strokes are going the same way as your slopes. It'll create a nice flow in your painting. That tip is from Bob Ross. Shout out Bob Ross. Fast forward. Zip, 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 zip. All right, now slow it down. Here is where I use the selection tool and I grab the top of those peaks and paint in with a much lighter color where the sun would be peeking in. But even that isn't enough, and so I go to my curves adjustments, and you'll see here in a second. Pop, I darken the darks and lighten the lights a little bit more so I can get that nice contrast. And I'm gonna speed it up again. You'll probably see some shadows appear and disappear, and that's me experimenting on new layers because I may not like what I see, and layers just make it so that you don't lose any of your old progress. So here we go. Zip, 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 zip. So next I'm going to be adding a little bit more color to the sky, because at sunset there really is a wide spectrum of color in the sky. That's what makes it so beautiful. And to reflect the atmosphere, I will start to add a little bit of a blue tone to my shadows, because shadows always tend to reflect their atmosphere. Another tip I have about shadows is that as they stretch, they will get softer and softer and softer. So, if a shadow is very close to the object, it'll be very sharp and defined. But if you have a sunset picture where those shadows are very long, as they stretch out, they will become softer and softer. And although I'm pushing all this talk on contrast, one problem people have is making things seem as if they were very far away. One way to achieve that look is by using a little less contrast and a little less color variation. Things in the very far background tend to pick up some of that sky color. So if this were a completely blue sky, a lot of the backdrop would be covered in a slightly blue haze, because you lose a lot of color variation and contrast in the atmosphere. Alright, here in a second, you're going to see me use the color balance adjustment to take those blues to a slightly more purple color, mainly because there's a little bit more purple in the sky come sunset. Alright, now I get to the kind of fun part, where I start thinking about what story am I trying to tell. And so just like everything else, I think of contrast. I think, what would be a nice contrast to the idea of an ancient pyramid in the background? Why not something modern like a robot? So just like the start of this piece, I start off simple. I start with shapes. Shapes that will be easily read with all of that complex background. And this shape had to be even more readable since half of it was buried in the sands. I wanted people to know it was a face, but maybe not right away. Sometimes I don't want to give the contrasting idea away. I want to make the viewer double take, make them discover it on their own, almost like solving a puzzle. And giving the viewer something to discover can be very rewarding, even if they don't know why. It'll keep them looking at the piece over and over again. So for this sped up segment, you'll see me adding a lot of the gritty details. You'll see me, 1, up the contrast again, because it just wasn't popping enough. And 2, you'll see me adding some highlights to the objects that are backlit. Some more gritty details are bounce lighting, which bounce lighting is the light source hitting an object, which may be the floor or a rock, and bouncing that light onto another object. So in this case, I knew the light source would be bouncing off of that sand and making the base of that head just a little bit lighter. I also thought about the wear and tear of it over time, how sand would build up on it, and all these little gritty details will really bring character to your piece. But then I started thinking, hey, what if this head buried in the sand won't be enough? What if people will think it's a house? What if people will think it's like some kind of shelter? So I thought I need to add another piece to this puzzle. So I thought, what about having another human form kind of coming out of the ground to solidify the mystery beneath the sands? So I went with some fingers emerging from the ground. And hands can be very intimidating for people, and honestly the best advice I can give you there is draw a lot of hands. It is scary, but I know the more you draw them, the easier it will become. I still have a long way to go. Next, I started to add some stick figure characters for scale. This lets you know how big certain objects will be. Trees are also a great indication of scale. Because we know how big trees should be, we know how big people should be, and so putting those things next to certain objects will give them a sense of scale. But just like hands, human anatomy and poses can be a very intimidating thing, and honestly the best advice I can give you is study them, draw them over and over and over and over again. Because honestly, if you do it enough, you will become better at it. So, speeding up again. Zip, 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 zip. Sometimes I will create a wireframe or an outline for complex shapes like a hand or a pose. And then other times I will turn them into silhouettes because I find it easier to work with, and I find if that silhouette will be a readable shape or not. Next, you'll see me reposition some of the objects, and that's because I kept them on separate layers, again because layers are great for experimenting. The reason behind the positioning is I tried to create a sense of flow within a piece. I want your eyes to constantly be moving around the piece. So I have the fingers slightly pointed towards the characters, and I have some of those slopes in the background purposefully sloped towards the head. Same with the rocks, same with the pyramid. I want your eyes to constantly be moving around my piece, and the objects in your piece can help that happen. So, for this last sped up segment, I am just keeping in mind all those things I've been emphasizing before, like contrast and flow, readability. And so if something's bugging me about the piece, I go in there and adjust it. The thing is to not get carried away with detailing everything, because details tend to draw our eye. That's why I saved all those gritty details for the head, because I really want your eye to focus in on that. And that's why the clouds are oversimplified. That's why the pyramid is kind of oversimplified, because that's not the center of the piece. The robot head is the center of the piece. And even there, I felt like I was losing some of it to those rocks in the background. So I brightened that path in between the rocks and the robot head. And I brightened one of those rock formations so that they didn't seem so close together. I gave it that sense of depth, like one of those rocks was just a little bit further in the background. And really, you could work your piece for months, for years. But at some point, you have to realize what's working, realize that you can't over-perfect everything, and call it done. Call it finished. Maybe not perfect, but finished. And I think that brings us to the end of this mini tutorial. There is so much more we could talk about, but maybe for another tutorial. As for now, I just want to thank you if you made it this far. I really hope you take away one of these tips. That'd be so awesome if I could be useful to you. And just remember to keep practicing. Have fun while you do it. And keep putting art out into the world. We need more artists desperately. Thank you so much for watching. You are awesome.